Am I the a-hole for not allowing my oldest daughter to use my home as her wedding venue because her mother and her family will be invited? I'm in a pretty bad situation right now. When my stepdaughter got married 2 years ago, she used our home as the wedding venue. We have a fairly large property, and one of the main reasons we bought it in the first place was because of the space. There's a wide open meadow behind the house that stretches out far enough to comfortably hold a large gathering without feeling crowded. Beyond that, there's a barn that had been renovated years ago. It's not decorative or rustic in the trendy sense, but it's clean, empty, and functional. With some effort, it can be set up with tables, lighting, and decorations in a way that works well for events. That's exactly what happened for that wedding. There was planning involved, but everything came together without any real issues. The ceremony was held in the meadow, and afterward everyone moved into the barn for dinner. It was simple, organized, and overall a good experience. There were no major conflicts, no unexpected problems, and no tension hanging over the day. It's something people still bring up occasionally as a positive memory. Because of that, I understand why my daughter thought of our home as an option. She had originally planned to get married at a separate venue last year. Everything had been arranged ahead of time, and from what I knew, she had been excited about it. Then the pandemic situation affected the business, and the venue shut down permanently. That left her without a location and forced her to start over with planning. When she came to me about using our home instead, I didn't respond right away. I knew what she was asking for, and I also knew what it would involve. It wasn't just about space or logistics. It was about who would be there. Her mother, my ex, and several members of her family would be invited. That part is where things become complicated. At one point, I had a restraining order against them. It wasn't something that happened suddenly or without reason. There had been a series of incidents that built up over time, including threats and harassment directed toward me and my wife. It wasn't limited to a single argument or disagreement. It reached a point where legal action felt like the only option to create some distance and protect our home. The restraining order eventually expired in the middle of last year. Since then, there hasn't been any direct contact. No messages, no visits, nothing that would suggest they're trying to reconnect or cause problems again. On the surface, it might look like things have settled. That doesn't mean the underlying issues disappeared. When my daughter asked to use the house, all of that came back into consideration. Allowing the wedding here would mean giving those people access to the property again. Not just briefly, but for an extended period of time, with the expectation that they would be able to move freely around the space. The part that makes me the most uncomfortable is the house itself. The ceremony and reception could take place outside, but realistically, people would still need to come inside for things like the washrooms. That means opening up the house to individuals I had previously needed legal protection from. I explained that to my daughter as calmly as I could. I didn't refuse immediately without discussion. I tried to make it clear that my hesitation wasn't about her or her wedding. It was about the situation surrounding who would be present and what that would mean for me and my wife. She didn't take it well. Up until this point, we hadn't had any major confrontations. There have been disagreements over the years, like in any family, but nothing that escalated to the level of shouting. This was different. The reaction was immediate and emotional, and it caught me off guard. It wasn't just disappointment. It was anger. After that initial conversation, things didn't settle down. If anything, they became more tense. The topic kept coming up, and each time it did, it felt less like a discussion and more like pressure. The expectation seemed to be that I would eventually change my mind if it was pushed enough. I tried to find a way to help without agreeing to host the wedding at the house. At one point, I offered to give her $15,000 so she could secure another venue. It wasn't a small amount, and I made it clear that it was meant to make things easier, not to control her decisions. I thought it would be seen as a reasonable compromise. It didn't change anything. She remained focused on having the wedding at our home. It became clear that the location itself mattered more than the alternatives being offered. From her perspective, it likely felt unfair that her stepsister was able to use the property while she wasn't. I can understand how it might look that way. What makes it difficult is that the situations aren't the same. When my stepdaughter got married, there weren't any underlying conflicts with the people attending. There was no history of threats or legal action. It was a straightforward event. This situation carries a different set of risks. While all of this was happening, the issue didn't stay private. My daughter posted about it on Facebook. Once that happened, it spread quickly. Extended family members started reaching out, and most of them took her side without asking for any details beyond what she had shared. The messages I received were not neutral. They were critical and, in some cases, accusatory. The general idea was that I was being unreasonable, that I was putting my own discomfort ahead of my daughter's wedding, and that I should be doing more to support her. At the same time, the situation seemed to reach my ex and her family as well. Even though there hadn't been any contact before, they became involved again through this. What made it worse was that my wife and stepdaughter were pulled into it. They hadn't said anything about the situation publicly or privately to my daughter. They weren't part of the decision-making process beyond being affected by it. Despite that, they were being blamed for influencing me or trying to interfere. That added another layer of tension inside the house. It's one thing to deal with outside pressure, but it's different when it starts affecting the people you live with. As things continued, I started to feel boxed in. Every direction I looked, there was some form of pressure. From my daughter, from extended family, from the situation itself. There didn't seem to be a way to resolve it that wouldn't create a problem somewhere else. Eventually, I reached a point where I started considering giving in. Not because I felt comfortable with it, but because it seemed like the only way to prevent the situation from getting worse. The idea was to allow the wedding to happen at the house and try to minimize my own involvement in the parts that made me uneasy. Part of that plan included asking my wife and stepdaughter not to be around during the event. It's not something I felt good about suggesting, but I was trying to avoid potential confrontations or uncomfortable situations. Even as I thought through that, I knew it would create its own problems. It would mean asking them to leave their own home for an event they weren't responsible for. It would likely lead to resentment or further conflict later on. There wasn't a version of this where everyone was unaffected. Before anything could be finalized, I tried one more attempt at a compromise. I messaged my daughter about using outdoor trailer bathrooms for the event. The idea was to keep most of the activity outside and limit access to the interior of the house. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it addressed the main concern I had about people coming inside. She rejected it immediately. The response was negative and dismissive, and it quickly turned into another argument. The focus shifted again to comparisons between her and my stepdaughter. She accused me of treating them differently and favoring one over the other. From her perspective, the evidence was clear. One was allowed to have her wedding at the house, and the other wasn't. From mine, the situations weren't comparable. That distinction didn't seem to matter. The conversation ended abruptly after that. She said she didn't want the wedding at the house anymore and hung up. Since then, she hasn't been answering my calls or responding to messages. Shortly after, I received a call from my mother. She told me that she would be hosting the wedding instead. The tone of the conversation made it clear that this wasn't open for discussion. She also said that I would not be welcome at the wedding. That part stayed with me. Not long after that, I found out that my father would be walking my daughter down the aisle. There wasn't any direct conversation about that with me. It was something I learned after the fact. At this point, everything feels settled in a way that I didn't expect. The decision has been made, the arrangements have shifted, and my role in it has been removed entirely. There isn't anything left for me to negotiate or fix. Thanks everyone for the advice. I appreciate it. But I feel like I've made the biggest mistake of my life. I'm completely heartbroken. Update. I've had quite a few messages asking for an update. I didn't see most of them until I logged back into this account, and I wasn't sure if I was going to post anything at first. A lot has happened since my original post, and things didn't unfold in a simple or clean way. That said, I do have a fairly positive update compared to where things were before. My daughter's wedding took place in October last year. The time between my original post and the wedding was difficult. For a while after everything happened, my daughter refused to talk to me at all. Calls would go unanswered, messages would sit without replies, and when she did respond, it was short and distant. There wasn't any real conversation happening, just minimal communication when necessary. The silence made everything feel heavier than the arguments themselves. There was no clear way to fix anything, and no opportunity to address what had already been said. During that period, things at home were tense in a quieter way. My wife was aware of how much the situation was affecting me. Even without constant arguments happening, it was obvious that I wasn't handling it well. It showed in small ways. I wasn't as focused, and I was more distracted than usual. It wasn't something I talked about much, but it was noticeable. At some point, my wife suggested that I should just let my daughter use our home for the wedding without any restrictions. The idea was to remove the conflict entirely by giving her what she originally wanted and avoiding further damage to the relationship. She suggested that we could secure anything valuable in the house, make the necessary preparations, and hope that nothing would go wrong. I was hesitant about that. The concerns I had before hadn't disappeared, and the idea of opening our home under those circumstances still didn't sit well with me. At the same time, things had already reached a point where the relationship with my daughter was strained in a way that felt worse than the original issue. After going back and forth on it, I agreed to make the offer. I arranged a meeting at my mother's home so that everyone could be there in a neutral setting. I didn't want to do it over the phone or through messages. It felt like something that needed to be said in person. When I brought it up, I explained that I was willing to let her use our home after all, without the earlier conditions. The response was immediate, and not what I had hoped for. I was told that it was too late. The invitations had already been sent out, and the wedding plans had been finalized to take place at my mother's property. There wasn't any room to reconsider or change the location at that point. That part was difficult to hear, but I understood it. By then, enough time had passed that they had moved forward without me being involved. However, the conversation didn't end there. My daughter asked if I would still give her the $15,000 I had originally offered. This time, it wasn't for a different venue, but to help renovate my mother's home to better accommodate the wedding. At that stage, I didn't see much point in pushing back. It felt like the situation had already settled into something I couldn't change. I agreed and gave her the money. Even after that, things didn't immediately improve between us. Communication stayed limited. There wasn't any noticeable shift in her attitude toward me. It remained distant, and any interaction we had felt more like an obligation than a genuine effort to reconnect. As the wedding got closer, I assumed that I would attend with my wife. There hadn't been any direct conversation about it, but I didn't expect there to be an issue with that specifically. About a month before the wedding, I was told otherwise. My daughter informed me that I was invited, but my wife was not. The reasoning she gave was tied to the same underlying issues that had been present from the beginning. Her mother and some members of her maternal family were uncomfortable being around us, even though the restraining order had expired. She explained that she was willing to push back on that to make sure I could attend, but she wasn't going to extend that to my wife, my stepdaughter, or my stepdaughter's husband. The line was drawn there. That was hard to accept. After everything that had already happened, it felt like another step backward. I had considered confronting her about it, or even choosing not to attend the wedding at all. The idea of going alone, under those circumstances, didn't feel right. My wife had a different perspective. She pointed out that there had already been too much conflict leading up to the wedding. From her point of view, attending quietly and avoiding further issues was the better option. She didn't want the situation to escalate again or create more stress around something that was already complicated. In the end, I followed her advice. I attended the wedding alone. The day itself was not what I had imagined it would be. Being there without my wife felt out of place, and the atmosphere was more strained than I expected. There weren't any major incidents, but the underlying tension was noticeable in smaller interactions. I stayed for the ceremony and part of the reception. I left after dinner. I did get to see my daughter get married, and that mattered. At the same time, the overall experience was overshadowed by everything that had happened leading up to it. It didn't feel like a celebration in the way I had hoped it would. Even the question of who would walk her down the aisle became complicated. It had been discussed, but it turned into something sensitive enough that it was eventually changed. She chose to have her half-brother walk her instead. I didn't argue with that decision. Before I left, I went to congratulate her. That interaction didn't go the way I had hoped either. She was still upset, and the conversation reflected that. She expressed frustration about how everything had turned out and made it clear that she felt the situation had been mishandled by both sides. There wasn't much I could say at that point beyond apologizing. I left shortly after that. The drive home was difficult. It felt like the end of something, even though nothing had been formally resolved. Since then, things have been slowly improving, but not in a dramatic way. There hasn't been a full reconciliation or a clear moment where everything went back to normal. Instead, it's been small, gradual steps. Occasional messages, brief conversations, and a sense that things are not as tense as they were before. A part of me is relieved that there is still some level of communication between us. At the same time, I do regret how everything unfolded. I can see how much stress the situation put on her, and while I still believe my concerns were valid, I also recognize that the way things escalated had a lasting impact. It wasn't her fault that her parents couldn't get along or that those issues carried over into her wedding. Right now, I'm not expecting things to fully return to how they were before. The focus is more on moving forward in a way that allows the relationship to rebuild over time. I'm just hoping that, eventually, things will settle into something better than where they ended up.